The purpose of this film is not to list all the historical facts, but mainly to create an impression of a horrific battleground, specifically in Belgium at the beginning of the 20th century, the Great War of 1914-18. It is also a homage to all those who gave their lives for our freedom. Imagine an open landscape of 10 by up to 3 kilometers, completely underwater. But this water is mixed with blood, lots of blood. The blood of people of many countries, colors, and origins, without distinction. This is Belgium in 1914-18, a major battleground, particularly in the region of West Hook. What led up to this? In 1914, Belgium was densely populated and one of the most prosperous countries in the world. It had the densest network of public transportation. It was an economic and industrial power, even if this prosperity was not yet visible in all layers of the population. Though Belgium was a neutral country, it had an army, so it was an armed neutral country. But the Belgian army had not grown and rearmed like other armies. Expenditures for the army were considered unnecessary because our country was neutral and other European countries respected this. What's more, the army had not always developed its technology, and Belgium had no direct experience of war. While we continued to live without concern, two major powers had emerged in Europe, France and Germany. Belgium sat right between them and wished to remain friends with both sides. People never imagined that Belgium could be caught up in a war. Germans had promised that they would never invade France by going through our country. No one imagined that they would do exactly that. In fact, Germany gave Belgium an ultimatum, simply stated, "You give us what we want, or we will take it." Germany wanted to invade France via our country, but Belgium rejected the ultimatum. This defiance was greeted with international acclaim. Belgium's stance showed faith in a civilized 20th century, one in which countries made agreements and there was no place for brute force. But Germany declared war on France and violated Belgium's neutrality. The Belgians agreed that we would not stand for this. While the hastily introduced universal conscription was not exactly met with widespread enthusiasm, Germany's treachery had sparked a wave of patriotism in the country. Crowds gathered on the streets to cheer the decision of our soldier king and the Council of Ministers. There was a feeling of national pride. This is how our country got sucked into the Great War, the longest and most intense conflict in which the Belgian army had ever participated. And so, the Germans invaded. Belgian gunboats of the Department of Coastal and River Defense quickly try to reach Ostend through the River Scheldt. The neutral Netherlands denies them passage, puts the ships in chains, and imprisons the crew in Rotterdam. Everywhere, the Germans met stiff resistance from the Belgian army. They had not expected this. Liège was surrounded by a ring of forts, in itself an outdated concept, but the Germans ended up banging their heads against the wall. Some of their units even fled. The recalcitrant Belgians were a model of resistance for the entire world. Was it not the Romans who said, "The Belgians are the bravest of all the Gauls"? Brave little Belgium. It was the tragedy of the First World War that earned our country this title. As a result of the very symbolic battles around Liège, and later in Namur and Antwerp, but especially the Battle of the Yser, the world would indeed speak of gallant little Belgium. The Germans eventually brought in the big guns, the Big Berthas. These huge cannons were capable of firing projectiles weighing nearly a ton across several kilometers. They bombarded the forts for 4 days. One shell landed directly on the ammunition dump in the fort of Lonsin. The consequences were apocalyptic. Albert I decides to attack the Germans on their flank when they turn to Antwerp. This gives the British and French time to regroup on the Marne. Nevertheless, the resistance of the Belgian army was efficient. This made the Germans nervous, because they had been told there were snipers everywhere in Belgium, and it also irritated them that we were openly pro-France. They took revenge by committing horrific acts and mass murders on Belgian citizens. They even deployed a massive Zeppelin to carry out an air attack on the city of Liège. This was obviously revenge for the resistance of the Belgian army. The number of Belgian citizens executed by German soldiers is estimated at 6,000. The worst massacre was in Dinant, where approximately 600 people died. But there are small villages in Wallonia that suffered much more in percentage terms. The most symbolic atrocity was the burning of the university library in Leuven. In addition, more than 1,000 homes were set ablaze in the town, and more than 200 residents were killed. By these means, the Germans tried to force the Belgians to surrender, which we had no intention of doing. This earned our country a second title, Poor Little Belgium. This reflects the fact that we were attacked by the most powerful state in Europe, and that, at the outset, we had to face them alone. The war was only 14 days old, and the situation was hopeless, retreat inevitable. Belgium had to yield more and more territory. The British came to help us in Mons, but their flanks were exposed by the retreating French, forcing them to retreat themselves. Even the 95-kilometer-long double ring of forts around Antwerp, in which people had placed great hope, soon fell. The death toll was high. The field army was reduced from 117,000 men to 70,000. But that it delayed the Germans in their advance is beyond doubt. It was not at all what the Germans had imagined, their high-speed train to Paris. Slowly, the Belgians retreated towards the North Sea. The First Battle of Ypres started on 14th of September and ended on the 22nd of November. Throughout the whole of the Great War, Ypres would form the backdrop of the war in the trenches. King Albert I was personally in command of the army and had no intention of spilling the blood of his soldiers by mounting attacks that were doomed to fail. The first trenches were dug on that same 14th of September along the entire length of the Western Front. The soldiers started by digging themselves into individual shelter holes. Over time, these were connected to one another. But in West Flanders, you hit water when you dig 60 to 70 centimeters deep, so they had to use sandbags, also called little fatherlanders, to build parapets high enough to offer protection against enemy fire. And thus were created the trenches, or moats, which were closely connected to the Yser front, and known as the Trenches of Death. Then there was the incredible story of how the Belgians decided to submerge most of the Yser basin underwater, thus creating an artificial lake that the Germans could not cross. And so, by October 1914, the German offensive ran into the last line of defense, the Yser in the West Hook. The Belgian front was now virtually impregnable. The original Trench of Death was 1,800 to 2,000 meters long. Some 12 to 15,000 people had to survive in this artificial, isolated world. There were no toilets, and the hygiene was wretched. Parasites, lice, rats. The living conditions of the ordinary soldier must have been atrocious. What's more, they could not take home leave, not once in 4 long years. The mail functioned poorly, if at all. Communication was possible between headquarters by carrier pigeon, but, if only for technical reasons, this could not be used for personal letters. meantime, the entire front had stabilized. Two armies were drawn up facing each other in lines that stretched from Newport to the Swiss border. The leaders of the German forces, who had the initiative and superior numbers, naturally tried to break through the Allied line. The General Staff of the Belgian Armed Forces at Calais founded the Floating Unit Service. Using Belgian camouflaged mail boats, about 36,000 refugees and 22,000 wounded were taken to Britain between October 1914 and March 1915. The Allies also chartered the merchant fleet to supply French or Belgian neutral ports. Belgian fishing ships helped with mine hunting and convoy escort duties along the coast. The Belgians were also fighting far beyond Belgium. For instance, an auto-cannon unit fought on the side of the Saar. The Force Publique from the Belgian Congo also distinguished themselves brilliantly in the war in German Southwest Africa. 2,000 soldiers and 7,000 Congolese carriers gave their lives for Belgium. The Belgian armed forces also created a crew depot, which was nearly 800 men strong by the end of the war. These sailors were active in merchant, fishing and mail boats, the French National Navy, and even the Royal Navy. Indeed, the North Sea became a second front, where submarines and mines took their deadly toll on a daily basis. The Department for Transport on Inland Waterways consisted of 16 steam tugs and 150 small inland ships, also called barges. They brought ammunition to the front via a channel system behind the Iron Front and carried off wounded soldiers. The Belgian population faced great hardship during all those years. The Germans plundered and humiliated them. They played the Flemish off against the Walloons. Regulations were pasted on walls everywhere, but they were mainly administrative harassment, and they were in German. People often had to move aside when Germans passed. They would be fined or be thrown in jail for the slightest infraction. An extensive resistance movement emerged. There were escape routes for young Belgians who wanted to join the army. A clandestine press fought against German propaganda. They did so by making the occupiers look ridiculous, and thus gave courage to a populace that was hit hard by the many crimes committed by the Germans. But people had to be careful. If the Germans suspected you were helping the enemy, you could face the death penalty. This was a true military reign of terror, with courts and tribunals that could be ruthless or more lenient, depending on which town you were in. was strictly forbidden to transport food, and yet people managed to smuggle a great deal. Nevertheless, if we had not had help from the Americans, and later the Spanish and Dutch, we would certainly have starved to death. Though only Germans were permitted to move around, many Belgians managed to flee across the borders. They needed passes for this, and these had to be paid for. More than 500,000 Belgians would be received abroad, sometimes staying in a sort of refugee camp. There was also mass deportation of Belgians to labor camps. The German government accused Belgium of causing a trench war. This trench war resulted in complete deadlock, and the adversaries started to bombard each other with all manner of new technological inventions: mortars, machine guns, and later also tanks and airplanes. The Westhoek experienced a grim premiere during the Second Battle of Ypres. Near Steenstraate, a weapon of mass destruction was used for the first time: poison gas. The battle ended 2 weeks later. The German Jewish professor who developed it, Fritz Haber, would receive the Nobel Prize in 1919 for this scientific work. Later, the British Army also used gas in the battle near Loos, but the wind changed direction, which resulted in the death of many of their own soldiers. The Third Battle of Ypres began in the summer of 1917. When the British reached Passchendaele in November, this signaled the end of the battle. The Allies were not amused when Russia and Germany signed a peace agreement at the end of 1917. For a long time, it remained uncertain how the war would end. But when the offensives the Germans launched in 1918 failed, everything collapsed, including the German economy. The liberation offensive got underway, and the Belgians left their trenches. In line with the general progress, our cable balloons continued to pinpoint the targets for our artillery. We captured the Flemish hillsides and liberated Bruges and Ostend. The nightmare is over. The liberation is drawing ever closer. As we were preparing to enter Ghent, Germany, totally exhausted, asked for a truce. And so, on the 11th of November 1918, at 11 o'clock, the First World War came to an end. On the 22nd of November, King Albert I and the royal family returned to a liberated Brussels. Ecstatic crowds cheered them to the echo. Now there was peace, but it had left indelible scars in our country. Aside from the many dead, badly injured and invalid, the material damage was catastrophic. The war had consumed 1/5 of our national wealth. The Germans had taken away much of our industrial plant. Reconstruction was going to be difficult. And Belgium was never properly compensated for all it had contributed and suffered. The First World War entirely redrew the map of Europe. Old regimes disappeared, and new states, such as the Soviet Union, would help determine the course of history from that point forward. Things would never be the same for the armed forces. The great danger for the victor in war is that he holds tight to what has worked in the past. In the First World War, the mistake was to have soldiers marching as they did in the time of Napoleon, even though they were now confronted with heavy firepower and precision. It had also become possible to shoot projectiles across long distances and in large numbers. All of this led to the exceptional death toll. We needed to learn the lessons of the First World War. But afterwards, people continued to believe that numbers were all important, failing to see that the future lay in mobility. It is tragic that preparations are often made for the previous war, not for the wars of the future. In retrospect, World War I is dismissed in some circles as faintly absurd, a war that did not have to be fought. But the fact remains that Germany invaded Belgium. The resistance that our forefathers put up against this was anything but absurd. If they had allowed the German troops free passage, the course of the war would have been completely different. Their resistance was crucial. They fought and died for our freedom. We should never forget their sacrifice.